Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that honestly seems pretty confusing on the surface. This intense US China rivalry happening at the same time as these, well, surprisingly positive sounding trade truces. I mean, just think about it. You've got this ongoing trade war, tariffs are sky high, averaging near 50%, according to our sources. And yet, after a recent meeting, you hear former President Trump calling Xi Jinping a great leader and rating their agreement a 12 out of 10. I mean, really? Yeah, that kind of enthusiasm, it just doesn't seem to match the reality on the ground, does it? So our mission today, specifically for you, the learner, is to cut through that noise. We want to look past the headlines and really understand the mechanics here. We'll focus on two big moments, that 2020 Phase 1 deal, which had its issues, and this more recent, very sudden agreement.
Exactly. And to do that properly, to really get clarity, we're going to use the Feynman technique. Richard Feynman, the physicist, his method is great for this. So first step, break things down, make them simple. Second, use analogies, real-world comparisons to make sense of the concepts. And third, and this is maybe the most important bit, figure out what we don't know. What are the key questions, the knowledge gaps that are still out there, even when people are declaring peace? Okay, so let's start with step one. Simplification. The main tool, the weapon really, in this whole conflict is the tariff.
Right. So let's get basic. What is a tariff? Just in simple terms, and crucially, who ends up footing the bill?
Well, fundamentally, a tariff is just a tax. As simple as that. It's a tax the government puts on goods coming in from another country. So if the U.S. puts a tariff on, say, Chinese batteries, it's the American company, the importer bringing them in, who pays that tax to the U.S. Treasury. And almost always that cost gets passed along, either to American businesses down the line or, ultimately to consumers like you and me through higher prices.
Okay, so it's a tax paid domestically, and that leads right into the dynamic that's really defined the last 5 years, this tit-for-tat cycle.
That's it, exactly. It's a really simple, almost predictable pattern. I tax your stuff, say 20%, claiming you're playing unfair. You immediately turn around and tax my stuff 20%, claiming I'm being protectionist.
Yeah.
So the U.S. hits China with Section 301 tariffs, and China hits back, often targeting things like American soybeans or farm goods, things that hurt politically in the U.S. It just spirals. Understanding this whole thing as basically a long, drawn-out tax fight that hurts both sides, that's really the starting point for getting clear.
Okay, so we understand tariffs and the tit-for-tat. Let's set the stage before these truces. What did the landscape actually look like, and what was the official reason, the justification the U.S. gave for starting this whole thing?
Well, the status quo was, frankly, high tension, high friction. Under both the Trump and then the Biden administrations, the U.S. piled on tariffs layer after layer. They eventually reached an average rate of about 20% on Chinese goods, and China, predictably, matched it. They also hit about a 20% average tariff rate on goods coming in from the U.S. So this 2020 baseline, that became the sort of new normal for several years. It was just baked in.
But the U.S. justification, it wasn't just, you sell us too much stuff, was it? It was tied to something specific, Section 301 of an old trade act aimed at deeper issues. Can you walk us through what the U.S. claimed China was doing wrong back in 2018?
Yeah, this is really important because Section 301 isn't just about collecting taxes. The idea is to force another country to change its ways, to stop what the U.S. considers unfair practices. The official investigation by the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR, it pointed to four main things. First, forced technology transfer. The sources say the USTR found China was essentially making foreign companies hand over their valuable technology to Chinese partners just to get access to the Chinese market or get investment approvals. Second was IP theft and licensing issues. They found China was getting U.S. intellectual property through various means, like cyber theft, but also using restrictive licensing rules that basically devalued U.S. tech once it was licensed in China. Third, something called state-directed outbound investment. This was about the Chinese government actively guiding Chinese companies to buy or invest in U.S. firms specifically to get their hands on sensitive American technology. And fourth, well, restricted market access. Kind of a catch-all, but it focused on things like unfair licensing rules or complex regulations. They clearly favored Chinese companies over foreign ones trying to compete there.
Okay, so the argument wasn't just about the trade balance. It was more like, hey, you're breaking the basic rules of fair competition. You're stealing our ideas and forcing companies to give up their edge just to do business. The tariffs were meant to be the leverage, right? To force China to change its whole state-run economic model.
Exactly. The stated aim was big structural change. But what we ended up getting in both the 2020 deal and this latest truce was something very different. It's called managed trade.
Managed trade, that term keeps coming up, and it sounds like the complete opposite of what the U.S. usually talks about, free markets and all that.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah.
Managed trade is pretty much the antithesis of free trade. Free trade, in theory, means minimal government interference. Goods flow based on price, quality, demand. Managed trade, that's when governments jump in and say, okay, country A, you will buy X amount of goods from country B this year based on some target. It's much more like planned commerce,
Yeah.
centrally directed.
Right. And this seems like a good spot for our first analogy using the Feynman approach to make this shift clearer. Let's imagine two neighbors, Alice and Bob, and they're in a nasty fight.
Okay. A really high-stakes
Yeah.
neighborhood squabble, yeah,
Huh.
with a big, ugly fence between them. That's the Tariffs.
Exactly. And they're fighting because Bob keeps, let's say, stealing Alice's designs for his fancy new fence posts. That's the intellectual property theft part. Now, a real solution, a structural one, would be Bob stops stealing, maybe they even tear down the fence. But managed trade, the approach in these deals, it's like Alice saying, look, Bob, the fence is staying up, you're still stealing my designs, but to keep the peace for now, I'm going to promise to buy, say, 300 bushels of apples from your orchard this year. It doesn't matter if I need them, doesn't matter the price, I'll just buy them.
That's a perfect analogy. It really captures it. The tariff stays up. The core problem, the IP theft, isn't fixed. But the focus shifts completely to this very specific, measurable purchase commitment. The apples, or in the real world, soybeans, energy, it gives a clear win to certain domestic groups back home, which is politically useful. It buys you a temporary truce, but it doesn't resolve the underlying fight at all.
So it's basically kicking the can down the road,
Hmm.
a way to cool things off without actually solving the deep strategic issues that Section 301 was supposed to tackle. Okay, so we get the shift to managed trade now. Let's dig into the two big examples. First, that Phase 1 deal back in 2020. It seemed ambitious at the time. Then we'll get into the more recent, almost disastrous escalation and the truce that followed.
All right, let's start with case study A, the Phase 1 deal, signed January 2020. And the first thing to remember, that the sources really stress this, is that it was a freeze, not a fix. Okay, the U.S. only rolled back one planned tariff hike. Most of the big Section 301 tariffs. They stayed right where they were. The main goal was just to stop things from getting worse, stop the tit-for-tat spiral, and set up a way for the two sides to talk directly if problems came up.
The deal itself, it was broken down into 8 chapters, according to the sources. For you, the learner, I think we need to spend a bit of time unpacking these, because it wasn't just about buying stuff. There's some structure in there too, right?
Absolutely. Looking at the chapters tells you what the U.S. was trying to achieve, even if it didn't fully work out. So Chapter 1 was intellectual property, IP. This got really specific. It talked about things like bad faith trademark filings, where someone in China might quickly register a famous American brand name before the U.S. company could. It also aimed for stronger rules against counterfeit goods online and better protection for patents, especially for things like medicines. The idea was to give U.S. companies a bit more legal ground to stand on.
Okay, IP. What was next? Chapter 2, technology transfer. This sounds like it goes right back to that core Section 301 complaint.
It did. This chapter said China had to stop forcing or pressuring foreign companies to hand over their tech. And importantly, it included promises on enforcing trade secrets, making it harder to just steal confidential business information.
Chapter 3 was agriculture, always a big one in U.S.-China talks. What was the focus there?
Yeah, this was super technical, but vital for American farmers. It was about getting rid of those non-tariff barriers, things like complicated food safety rules or inspection processes that China has sometimes used to block U.S. farm products. The goal was to get clearer, science-based standards, making it easier to sell things like beef, dairy, poultry into China.
Then Chapter 4, financial services, opening up China's huge financial sector.
That was the idea. China made commitments to let U.S. banks, insurance companies, investment firms, and so on operate in China with more control, even allowing 100% foreign ownership in some cases. On paper, that was a pretty significant step.
Chapter 5 dealt with macroeconomic stuff and exchange rates. Currency manipulation has always been a sore point.
Right. So this chapter was about transparency. China promised to be more open about how it manages currency, the yuan, and basically vowed not to deliberately push its value down just to make Chinese exports cheaper. It gave the U.S. a formal way to challenge them if they thought currency manipulation was happening.
Okay, 5 down. Chapter 6 must be the big one. Expanding trade the purchases. This is the managed trade part, everyone remembers.
This is the one, yeah. China committed to buy at least $200 billion more in U.S. goods and services over the next 2 years, 2020 and 2021. That was compared to a baseline year, 2017. And it specified amounts across manufacturing, agriculture, energy, and services. This was the heart of the managed trade promise. Quantifiable, measurable targets.
In the last two chapters, 7 was dispute resolution, 8 was evaluation. What were they about?
The dispute resolution part, Chapter 7, was really interesting. It set up a special bilateral system just between the U.S. and China to handle arguments quickly. It involved high-level officials meeting directly. The U.S. really wanted this to bypass the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which they felt was just too slow and couldn't handle China's state-controlled economy effectively. It was meant to be like a quick pressure release valve. Chapter 8 just laid out how they check progress.
Wow, okay. That's actually a pretty detailed framework when you lay it all out. So the billion-dollar question, or maybe the $200 billion question, did phase 1 actually work? What do the sources say? Sounds like a mixed bag, maybe worse.
Well, on the part everyone watched the purchases, the answer is pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
It was a decisive failure. The sources show China missed those $200 billion plus targets by a huge margin. They just didn't buy anywhere near what they promised for 2020 and 2021.
Why not? What went wrong there? Especially on energy. That always seems politically critical.
Yeah, it was kind of a perfect storm, really. Three big things happened. First, obviously, COVID-19 hit right after the deal was signed. That just wrecked global demand, messed up supply chains. Suddenly, those fixed purchase numbers looked totally unrealistic.
Okay.
Second, you had wild price swings, especially in energy. So even if China spent the dollars, the actual amount of oil or gas they got could vary massively, making the targets hard to hit consistently. And third, specifically on energy, there's a question of whether the U.S. even had the capacity to the pipelines, the export terminals, to ship that much liquefied natural gas, LNG, or crude oil that quickly, even if China had wanted to buy every drop.
Right.
So, yeah, the most visible part of the managed trade experiment, it basically failed.
Okay, purchases failed. But what about the other stuff? The structural bits in those other chapters, IP protection, financial services access. Did any of that stick? Is there a lasting legacy there?
It's definitely mixed. On paper, yeah, there were some real improvements. U.S. financial firms did get better access, and the rules for agricultural trade became clearer. But the deal really didn't touch the biggest underlying problems Section 301 was supposed to fix. Things like massive Chinese government subsidies to their industries, the state's huge role in pushing technology development, those deeper systemic issues weren't resolved at all. The dispute resolution mechanism. It did seem to work for a while in preventing new tariffs from being slapped on. It acted like that pressure valve. But it didn't have the power, the teeth, to actually force China to meet the purchase targets or make fundamental changes to its economic system.
So phase 1 ends up looking like a temporary truce built on a promise that couldn't be kept. And once that deal effectively expired, it sounds like things got really nasty again, leading to case study B. The recent escalation in truce in 2023, you said chaotic.
Oh, it was more than chaotic.
Right.
It was bordering on self-destructive. Remember, those core 20% average tariffs from before phase 1, they were still mostly in place. But the conflict just spiraled upwards again, peaking right before this recent meeting. The sources talk about this tit-for-tat trade war that climaxed with the U.S. hitting some Chinese goods with a staggering 145% tariff, and China firing back with 125% on some U.S. stuff. Plus, China had already brought back its embargo on U.S. soybeans and started restricting some strategic materials. It was getting really ugly.
Okay, let's simplify this recent blowup. What triggered the specific, really sharp escalation? Sounds like it came down to two really technical but powerful moves. The U.S. bringing in this 50% rule and China hitting back with a threat involving rare earth elements, REE.
Yes, exactly. The 50% rule needs a bit of explaining because it's complex but had a huge impact. So the U.S. Commerce Department already had a list of big Chinese tech companies that were sanctioned, restricted from getting U.S. tech. The new 50% rule basically said, if any of those big sanctioned companies own 50% or more of another smaller company, then that smaller company is also automatically subject to the same restrictions, even if the smaller company wasn't on the original list itself.
Whoa, okay, so what did that mean in practice? Why was that such a bombshell for China?
Well, think about it. These big Chinese state-linked tech firms, they have ownership stakes, sometimes majority stakes, in literally thousands of smaller suppliers all across China. Companies making maybe simple components, specialized plastics, basic sensors, things that weren't considered strategic before. Suddenly, overnight, potentially thousands of these smaller companies found themselves cut off from U.S. technology or facing U.S. trade restrictions, often with no warning. It created massive uncertainty. Beijing saw it as the U.S. drastically expanding its reach, choking off supply chains in unpredictable ways.
It sounds like a really targeted way to cause maximum disruption by hitting the ownership structure. And China's response, leveraging rare earth elements, sounds equally strategic, hitting a known U.S. vulnerability.
Absolutely. China's counterpunch was the REE threat. They announced new export rules. Basically, any company anywhere in the world wanting to export a product containing even tiny amounts of rare earth materials sourced from China would need approval from Beijing first. And you have to grasp why REEs are such a choke point. China doesn't just mine most of the world's rare earths, over 60%. More importantly, they control almost 90% of the processing capacity, turning the raw dirt into usable materials. And these 17 elements, they're in everything advanced. Magnets for EV motors, high-tech sensors, defense systems like the F-35 jet.
So by controlling the export of trace amounts, China could basically hold veto power over huge swaths of the global high-tech supply chain, even potentially blocking finished products made in other countries if they contain Chinese RES.
That was the implication. It was a huge strategic lever. It could potentially neutralize U.S. efforts to control advanced chip exports to China by controlling exports from the rest of the world containing Chinese materials, tit for tat on a whole new level. On top of that, China slapped punitive port fees back on U.S. ships. And Trump's reaction. He announced a killer blow, a retaliatory 100% flat tariff on all imports from China set to start November 1st. So going into that recent meeting, both sides were staring down the barrel of a gun, 100% tariff, the 50% rule causing chaos, and China holding the REE veto.
Okay, the brinkmanship was intense. So what exactly got pulled back at the meeting? What were the specific concessions that led Trump to rate it 12 out of 10? Must have been pretty significant retreats.
Well, the truce was all about immediate de-escalation, pulling back those most damaging moves. So the U.S. agreed to withdraw that controversial 50% rule. That was huge for China. The U.S. also suspended its port fees. And crucially, on tariffs, the U.S. backed down from the threatened 100% flat tariff and actually reduced its average tariff rate slightly. The sources say it brought the average down by about 10%, landing somewhere around 48%. Still incredibly high, mind you, but a step back from the brink. Trump also hinted at maybe relaxing some restrictions on chips, but, and this is key, he made it clear the restrictions on the most advanced cutting-edge chips would absolutely stay in place.
And what did China give up?
China mirrored the U.S. moves. They agreed to withdraw those powerful rare earth element export restrictions. They suspended their port fees too.
Yeah.
And then, the familiar part, they committed to start buying large amounts of American soybeans again and also American energy.
Wow. It really does sound like phase one reprise, doesn't it? Step back from total disaster, but the solution is buy more farm goods and energy.
It's uncanny, isn't it? The focus is right back on those tangible, specific purchases. Soybeans, energy things that play well politically back in the U.S., especially in farm states and energy-producing regions. It's designed for that immediate, visible win. But it doesn't fundamentally change the huge trade imbalance. It doesn't resolve the core Section 301 issues about technology or state control. The only real difference from 2020, that massive tariff wall is still there, now averaging close to 50%. It shows the rivalry isn't gone. It's just become a permanent, high-cost feature of the relationship.
Okay, so the tariffs are huge. They seem pretty permanent now, which brings us back to that fundamental question we asked at the start. Who actually paid for all this? We need the concrete economics here.
Yeah, and the economic studies cited in the sources are pretty much unanimous on this.
Yeah.
It was U.S. consumers and U.S. businesses that rely on imports who paid the vast majority of the tariff bill. The estimates are that something like 90%, maybe even more, of the cost landed squarely on the U.S. side.
So, despite all the political talk about China paying the tariffs, the reality, the economic reality, is the tax was paid by the American company bringing the goods in. And they either ate the cost or, more likely, passed it on to their customers here.
That's exactly what the data shows. It's the U.S. importer who writes the check to the Treasury. And businesses facing these massive new costs, they basically had three ways to cope. One, they could just absorb the cost, which meant lower profits, smaller margins. Two, they could pass the cost increase directly to consumers, which we saw happen with prices going up on lots of imported goods. Or three, they could get creative and try something called tariff engineering.
Tariff engineering, that sounds intricate. Can you break that down for us for the learner? What does that actually involve?
It's a really fascinating, perfectly legal way businesses adapt. Essentially, companies would redesign their products or change how they were packaged or assembled, specifically so the goods would qualify under a different customs category, a different harmonized tariff schedule, or HTS code, one that had a lower tariff rate. So here's a concrete example. Let's say a fully assembled widget coming from China gets hit with that huge 48% tariff. A company might figure out, okay, what if we ship the main components separately? Or maybe just do a tiny bit of final assembly here in the US or maybe in Mexico. If they could reclassify the shipment as just parts or an unassembled kit, maybe that HTS code only has a 5% or 10% tariff. They are literally engineering the product and the process to fit into a lower tax bracket. It shows just how much effort and extra cost businesses went through just to try and lessen the blow of these tariffs.
It really highlights that the economic hit wasn't just the tax itself, but all the added complexity, the redesign costs, the supply chain reshuffling needed just to navigate the policy.
Absolutely. And speaking of costs and complexity, we have to talk about the farmers again. They were in a unique spot directly targeted by Chinese retaliation, but also the supposed beneficiaries of these managed trade purchase promises.
Yeah, their experience was pure whiplash. First they might see a big surge in purchases because of the Phase 1 commitments, then boom, China slaps on an embargo or just stops buying, and the market collapses. Uncertainty ruled. The sources make it clear that without huge amounts of federal aid programs, bailouts basically, the impact on the farm sector could have been absolutely devastating. And the fact that soybeans and energy are again central to this new truce just shows how politically vital that sector remains in any U.S.-China negotiation.
So all this ongoing risk, the high tariffs, the sudden rule changes like the 50% rule, the unpredictable purchases, it forced businesses to think differently, right? It wasn't just about finding the cheapest supplier anymore. It became about survival, about resilience. That's the big shift. We entered the era of supply chain resilience. What we saw wasn't trade completely stopping, but a definite, calculated move to diversify away from putting all eggs in the China basket. Countries like Vietnam, Mexico, others in Southeast Asia, they saw a big influx of manufacturing activity as companies looked for alternatives to avoid the high U.S. tariffs. Businesses learned they needed to dual-source key components, get them from China and somewhere else. They started holding more inventory, bigger buffers, just in case of sudden disruptions. All of that costs money, ties up capital, but it became the price of doing business in this new environment.
This seems like the right place for our second analogy, again using the Feynman approach, to simplify how businesses adapted to these persistent high tariffs. If the tariff is a tax, maybe we can compare these permanent-seeming tariffs to a toll booth on a permanent detour.
A toll booth on a permanent detour.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. It captures the feeling that this isn't temporary and there's always a cost involved now.
Right. Businesses didn't just stop driving, stop trading. The destination, China's incredible manufacturing ecosystem, its skilled workers, its huge domestic market that was often still too important to abandon completely. But the route definitely changed. Some companies, maybe their supply chains were too complex or integrated to move easily. They just decided to pay the incredibly steep toll, that 47–48% tariff, because the direct route, even with the cost, was still the best option for them.
While others looked at that toll and said, no way, it's just too expensive. So they took the detour, they shifted assembly or sourced key parts from Vietnam or Mexico or elsewhere. Now, that detour, it's longer, it's more complicated, adds logistical headaches, maybe quality control issues initially, but it bypasses that massive U.S. tariff toll booth. The key point is trade didn't stop, but the friction, the cost, the inefficiency, that's all permanently higher now. The relationship itself is just fundamentally strained.
And that strain means that for certain really important sectors, trade isn't just about price anymore. It runs through what you might call a policy filter.
That's the core of this selective interdependence idea. If you're a company dealing in really strategic stuff, advanced semiconductors, EV batteries, solar panel materials, certain types of machinery, your ability to buy or sell isn't just about having the best product at the best price. It depends heavily on government rules, export controls, sanctions lists, policy decisions made in Washington or Beijing. We saw that crystal clear with the U.S. chip restrictions and China's RE threat. Policy dictates the flow, not just market forces.
Okay, so we've simplified, we've used analogies. Now, the third part of the Feynman technique, identify the gaps. Where's the information still fuzzy? What are the key things we, the learner, need to keep an eye on because the answers aren't clear yet from this latest truce?
Yeah, there are definitely some big unanswered questions hanging out there. Based on the sources, I see 3 critical knowledge gaps. Knowledge gap 1. What exactly is China committing to buy when they say American energy? Trump talked it up, sure, but the sources emphasize there were no specific numbers, no detailed contracts signed. Is this going to translate into major long-term deals for U.S. liquefied natural gas, LNG? That would be huge. Or is it just a vague promise that might not amount to much? The energy industry and U.S. politicians, they need clarity on the specifics.
That's a big one. Okay, knowledge gap 2.
Knowledge gap 2. Chips. Trump mentioned relaxing some restrictions, but explicitly said not the most advanced ones. Where's that line drawn exactly? If the U.S. keeps tight controls on the really cutting-edge semiconductors and the equipment needed to make them, then China's big push for tech self-sufficiency still faces major hurdles. How relaxed these restrictions really are will tell us a lot about the true level of strategic competition remaining.
Makes sense. The devil's in the details there. And the third gap.
Knowledge gap 3. Enforcement. How is this new deal actually going to be enforced? And maybe more importantly, what happens if China doesn't meet these new purchase targets for soybeans and energy, just like they missed the Phase 1 targets? The deal apparently needs to be renewed annually, which gives the U.S. some leverage. But is there a specific penalty spelled out? Like, will the 50% rule automatically snap back on if they fall short? Without a clear or else, these purchase promises could end up being pretty weak again. We need to know the consequence structure.
Right. That ambiguity is probably intentional, keeps everyone guessing, but it also makes the whole truce feel inherently unstable. If those purchase numbers disappoint again, does the U.S. actually pull the trigger during the annual review, or is the political cost of starting the fight all over again just too high? We just don't know.
So pulling back a bit, what's the bigger picture here? What's the long-term takeaway from these two truce attempts, Phase 1 and the recent one?
I think the main legacy is that they've cemented a kind of new normal in the U.S.-China economic relationship. Yeah, it feels like the old assumptions are gone. The idea that globalization just keeps rolling forward, that economies get more integrated, that seems over, at least between the U.S. and China. The new normal looks like, well, persistently high tariffs, like that 47% average, plus these very targeted controls, especially around technology. The truces didn't end the rivalry. They just sort of managed it, maybe even formalized it.
And notice how the language has shifted, too. A few years ago, you heard a lot of talk about decoupling, completely separated the two economies. That turned out to be, well, practically impossible and potentially disastrous given how intertwined things are, especially in manufacturing. So now the buzzword you hear everywhere, from Washington to Brussels to Tokyo, is de-risking.
De-risking. Okay, what's the difference? How is that different from decoupling?
De-risking is more targeted. It's not about cutting all ties. It's about reducing reliance, limiting exposure, specifically in areas deemed critical or sensitive. So think advanced semiconductors, critical minerals for batteries, pharmaceutical ingredients, defense supply chains. The idea is to build resilience in those key areas without necessarily stopping trade in, T-shirts or furniture. It's a more surgical approach to managing the competition and securing national interest. And this whole shift, this focus on de-risking and resilience, it's fueling what you could call the industrial policy race. The competition isn't just about tariffs anymore. It's a battle using subsidies, setting technical standards, defining rules about where products originate, all aimed at dominating key industries of the future. We see it with massive government spending programs like the Chip Banzer Act and the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., or China's long-standing Made in China 2025 initiative. Both sides are pouring money into building domestic supply chains for electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, artificial intelligence chips. The trade war has kind of morphed into this high-stakes industrial competition.
So, if tariffs are high, trade is managed, and everyone's subsidizing their own industries, what does that do to the old global trading system? The sources seem to suggest the World Trade Organization, the WTO, is getting left behind in all this.
Yeah, the WTO's role seems significantly diminished in this new landscape because these big players, the U.S. and China, they aren't really relying on the WTO's rules or dispute settlement system to manage their relationship anymore. They're doing it through these direct, often tense negotiations and ad hoc deals. So we're seeing two trends shaping future trade governance. First, the rise of these ad hoc deals. Instead of big, comprehensive trade agreements that cover everything like the WTO tries to do, you get these smaller, specific, often bilateral mini-deals. They focus on fixing immediate problems like getting soybean purchases restarted or temporarily lowering a specific tariff. Very pragmatic, very politically driven.
Okay, ad hoc deals. And the second trend?
Second is the emergence of friend-shoring clubs. Basically, if you don't trust your main rival, you focus on strengthening trade and investment ties with countries you do trust, countries that are politically aligned. So you see efforts to build supply chains that run through friendly nations, creating these kinds of economic blocs or coalitions focused on mutual security and stability, deliberately excluding adversaries.
So putting it all together, the high tariffs, the tech controls, the subsidy race, the WTO fading, these ad hoc deals, and friendshoring, what's the bottom line? How would you describe the state of play between the U.S. and China now?
I think the best way to describe it is selective interdependence.
The selective interdependence.
Meaning the two economies are still linked. They have to be, to some extent. They're too big. China's manufacturing power is too central to global supply chains to just cut ties completely. Trade definitely continues. But that interdependence is now heavily managed and restricted. It operates on a much shorter leash, especially in any sector deemed politically sensitive or strategic. On those issues, the leash is held very tightly by policymakers in Washington and Beijing, not by market forces or efficiency. It's a relationship defined by ongoing friction, managed conflict, where these truces are really just temporary pauses to avoid full-blown disaster, not genuine steps towards resolving the core rivalry.
It really is a long game, isn't it? Played across this huge, seemingly permanent tariff wall. Hashtag tag outro. Well, this has been quite the deep dive. We've used the Feynman technique, hopefully, to cut through some of the fog around U.S.-China trade. We looked at why Phase 1's big purchase promises didn't really pan out, how things escalated almost to the breaking point with the REE threats and the 50% rule, and how this latest truce brought us back from the brink but landed us in a place with incredibly high tariffs, still focused on specific things like soybeans and energy.
And it's worth remembering that economic reality, even with the truce, that average tariff rate near 47% means Chinese exporters are still facing massive barriers compared to just a few years ago. The sources suggest this deal leaves China significantly worse off than the pre-trade war status quo. The fundamental conflicts over tech and state subsidies, they're still there, just being managed, not solved.
Which brings us back to that initial contradiction, the tough reality versus the enthusiastic political spin. The sources pointed out this apparent shift in Trump's focus, maybe moving from wanting a grand reordering of global trade early on to now seeming to settle for deals centered on, as some put it, almost trivial issues like soybeans and port fees just to get a truce done.
And that tees up our final thought, a question for you, the learner, to really chew on. Is this focus on the immediate, tangible wins, like getting soybean sales back on track, does that signal a real scaling back of strategic goals? Is the aim now just political survival, keeping key domestic groups happy?
Yeah.
Or is grabbing these small, politically useful concessions simply the only practical way to de-escalate right now, a tactic to buy time and avoid catastrophe, while the much deeper, long-term strategic competition grinds on underneath? Are soybeans a strategy or just a convenient Band-Aid on a much bigger wound?
Yeah. Is it a fundamental change or just playing the hand you're dealt in a really tough game? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us and for providing the source material that made this deep dive possible. We definitely encourage you to keep tracking those knowledge gaps we identified, especially the real details on energy purchases and exactly where the line gets drawn on those chip restrictions. The story is far from over.